My name is Addison Prescott. I am 22 years old, and for the last 4 years, I have defined my worth by the precision of orbital mechanics and the demanding rigors of aerospace engineering. But none of those complex equations could have prepared me for the moment my own father looked through me as if I were a line of failed code. I was exactly 14 credits away from my degree at Georgia Tech, 14 credits away from a life I had built with every ounce of my own sweat and late-night caffeine-fueled focus, when the floor was ripped out from under me not by a technical failure, but by a calculated betrayal. "We did not steal your money, Addison. We reallocated a family asset to a child who actually has a future in the Ivy League," my father said, his voice as cold and sterile as a surgical suite. He was standing in the foyer of our home in Buckhead, Atlanta, a sprawling 7-bedroom estate where the air always smelled of expensive sandalwood candles and unspoken expectations. And he didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye while he dismantled my future. Instead, he was focused on the mirror, meticulously adjusting his $450 midnight blue Ferragamo silk tie, ensuring the knot was perfectly centered beneath his chin, while he calmly explained that the $280,000 my grandmother had specifically left in a trust for my education had been drained to pay for my brother's sophomore year at Princeton. But I am getting ahead of myself, and perhaps I should take you back to the beginning of this disaster so you can understand the sheer weight of the injustice. Growing up in the Prescott household meant living in the shadow of a legacy that I was never quite polished enough to inherit. My father, Julian Prescott, is a senior partner at a top-tier wealth management firm where he handles portfolios that rarely dip below 8 figures, and my mother, Eleanor, spends her days organizing charity galas at the Piedmont Driving Club. They are people of optics, people who believe that a child is not an individual but a branding opportunity for the family name. Then there is my brother, Sterling. Sterling is 20 months younger than me, the golden boy with the effortless charm and the inherited charisma that I somehow missed in the genetic lottery. While I spent my weekends in the high school robotics lab, grease under my fingernails and my hair tied back in a messy bun, Sterling was captain of the tennis team and the darling of every debutante ball in the city. When I got into Georgia Tech for one of the most competitive engineering programs in the country, my father offered a polite nod and a comment about how it was a shame I didn't aim for a school with more social prestige. When Sterling got into Princeton, largely thanks to a renovated library wing donated by my father's firm, they threw a party that cost more than my first 2 years of tuition. The contrast between us was never a secret. It was a daily bread of my existence. My room was at the end of the hall, filled with blueprints, soldering irons, and stacks of textbooks on fluid dynamics, while Sterling's room was a shrine to his athletic achievements and his social standing. I was the workhorse, the one who stayed up until 3 a.m. calculating the thrust-to-weight ratios for my senior design project, while he was the show pony. I never complained because I had my grandmother's trust. Nana Grace was the only one who truly saw me. She was a woman who had been a codebreaker in the 50s, a sharp-witted mathematician who understood that my love for the stars wasn't a phase but a calling. When she passed away during my freshman year, she left a specific fund handled by my father as the executor, intended to cover my tuition, my housing at the North Avenue apartments, and the specialized software licenses I needed for my research. I thought I was safe. I thought that even if my parents didn't value my path, Nana Grace had guaranteed I would be able to walk it. The realization hit me on a Tuesday afternoon, a day that started with the mundane frustrations of a broken coffee maker and ended with the collapse of my identity. I had gone to the bursar's office because I noticed a hold on my account for the upcoming spring semester. I assumed it was a clerical error, a simple glitch in the system that a quick phone call to my father would resolve. But as I stood in that sterile office, the air conditioning humming a low, mocking tune, the administrator told me that the wire transfer from the Prescott Trust had been declined due to insufficient funds. My heart didn't just drop, it seemed to stop beating entirely. I drove my 2018 silver Honda Civic, a car I bought with my own internship money from Lockheed Martin, back to Buckhead with my hands shaking so hard on the steering wheel that I had to pull over twice. When I finally walked through those massive mahogany front doors, I found my father preparing for a dinner meeting with a group of investors at Bones Restaurant, where a single steak costs more than my monthly grocery budget. He didn't turn around when I confronted him. He stood there in his custom-tailored charcoal suit, the fabric catching the light from the crystal chandelier, and delivered the news as if he were discussing a minor adjustment in a stock portfolio. He explained that Sterling had run into some legal trouble over the summer, a reckless driving charge involving a 2024 Porsche 911 Carrera that had been quietly hushed up with a series of very expensive legal fees and a private settlement. To maintain Sterling's standing at Princeton and cover the astronomical costs of his fraternity dues and a new luxury apartment off campus, my father had decided that my engineering degree was a secondary priority. He told me that aerospace was a volatile field anyway, that a girl like me would be better off taking a few years off to work and perhaps find a more sensible, less demanding career path. The injustice of it was a physical weight in my chest, a burning heat that radiated from my stomach to my throat. I had maintained a 3.9 GPA, I had secured a prestigious internship, and I was on the verge of a career that would actually contribute something to the world. Yet I was being discarded to fund the debauchery of a son who treated his education like a social club. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, the man I had spent 22 years trying to impress looked small. He looked like a man who feared the truth, a man who would rather bankrupt his daughter's future than admit his son was a failure. The $450 tied around his neck in silk was a symbol of everything wrong with the world he lived in. It was a world where loyalty was a currency you only spent on the people who made you look good. As I stood in that foyer, surrounded by the opulence of a life that was now closed to me, I realized that my father didn't see a daughter. He saw an asset that no longer yielded the desired social return. He didn't care about the 14 credits. He didn't care about the years of work or the fact that I was carrying Nana Grace's dream in my pocket. He cared about the Ivy League sticker on the back of a car that Sterling would likely crash before the end of the year. Now, as I sit in my car in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, the neon sign flickering a harsh red against the dashboard, I am forced to reconcile the person I thought I was with the person I have been forced to become. I am Addison Prescott, and I am currently staring at a bank balance of $1,422, wondering how I will pay for my final semester when the people who were supposed to protect me are the ones who robbed me. But there is a quiet fire beginning to burn beneath the shock. My father thinks he has ended my story, but he has only succeeded in stripping away the last of my illusions. He thinks that without his money and his name, I am nothing. But he forgets that I am an engineer. I am trained to solve problems, to find the structural weaknesses in a design and rebuild it to be stronger. If he wants to treat my life like a game of reallocation, then he should be prepared for the moment the data shifts. The silence of the night is heavy, filled with the scent of old fries and the distant sound of the interstate. I think about Nana Grace and the way she used to say that the stars don't belong to the people who can afford the biggest telescopes, but to the people who are willing to do the math to find them. My father can keep his Ferragamo ties and his high society connections. He can keep the house and the trust fund he stole from me. He has taken my money, but he cannot take the knowledge I have spent 4 years pouring into my brain. He cannot take the 14 credits I have already earned, and he certainly cannot take the fact that I am his daughter, no matter how much he tries to erase me from the family ledger. Family is supposed to be the foundation you build upon, the one constant in a world of variables. But I am learning the hard way that blood is not always a bond. Sometimes it is just a biological coincidence. Real family is not defined by the name on a birth certificate or the distribution of an estate. It is found in the people who stand by you when the assets are gone and the prestige has faded. As I put my car into gear and pull out of the lot, I know one thing for certain. I will finish those 14 credits. I will get that degree. And when I am standing on the launch pad of my own life, looking up at the sky I was always meant to reach, I will remember the night my father told me I didn't have a future, and I will be grateful that I finally stopped trying to fit into his. My life was never a collection of spontaneous memories or carefree weekends, but rather a meticulously managed series of Excel spreadsheets, color-coded by priority, and calculated down to the very last decimal point of a projected grade point average. While other students at Georgia Tech were exploring the nightlife of Midtown Atlanta or spending their Saturdays tailgating outside Bobby Dodd Stadium, I was usually perched on a stiff ergonomic chair in the Guggenheim Aerospace building, my eyes blurring against the harsh blue light of a monitor at 4 a.m. These pre-dawn study sessions were not a choice, but a necessity for survival in a major that demanded absolute cognitive precision, where a single misplaced decimal in a structural load calculation could mean the theoretical death of a crew. To fund the gaps that the rising cost of living in the city created, I worked 25 grueling hours a week at the campus propulsion lab, earning a modest $15.50 an hour by cleaning delicate testing equipment and cataloging heat-resistant alloy samples. My uniform for this life of quiet academic labor was a rotation of 3 faded university t-shirts and a single pair of gray New Balance sneakers that I had purchased for $40 on sale 3 years ago, their soles now worn dangerously thin and the mesh stained with the faint, indelible scent of jet fuel and industrial lubricant. I didn't care about the aesthetic decay of my wardrobe because my focus was entirely on the digital number reflected in my Charles Schwab savings account, which held exactly $64,250. This sum was not a gift from my parents, but a sacred trust fund from my late grandfather, a man who had spent 40 years working as a civil engineer and who had specifically earmarked those funds to cover my final year of undergraduate study and my entire master's program. That money represented my autonomy, my ticket out of the Prescott shadow, and the fuel for a career that would eventually take me to the propulsion laboratories of NASA or SpaceX. In staggering, painful contrast to my existence of calculated scarcity and exhausted ambition was my younger sister, Skylar. At 19 years old, Skylar was the undisputed face of the family, the biological manifestation of our parents' vanity and the recipient of every indulgence they could possibly conjure. She didn't live her life in the quiet corners of a library or the sterilized air of a lab, but rather in the high-definition glare of social media and the curated luxury of the Atlanta social scene. Skylar attended a local university known more for its Greek life and poolside tailgates than its academic rigor, a place she referred to as her party college with a sense of pride that I found utterly baffling. Despite the fact that she was currently failing 3 out of her 5 introductory level classes, including a basic communications course that she couldn't be bothered to attend, my parents treated her academic incompetence as a charming quirk of her artistic personality. To reward her for simply existing, my father had signed a lease on a pristine Alpine white 2023 BMW 4 Series Gran Coupe with a Tacora red Sensatec interior, a vehicle that radiated an aggressive level of wealth every time she accelerated out of our driveway. My parents didn't just provide the car, they fully subsidized the lifestyle that went with it, dutifully paying the $820 monthly lease payment, the exorbitant insurance premiums for a teenage driver with a lead foot, and a seemingly bottomless gas card. I would watch from the window as she tossed her $3,000 quilted Chanel handbag into the passenger seat, the sunlight reflecting off the BMW's polished chrome, while I laced up my tattered New Balances to walk to the MARTA station. The disparity was not just financial, it was fundamental to how we were perceived within the 4 walls of our home. When I mentioned that I had secured a research assistantship that would look incredible on my resume, my mother would barely look up from her iPad, perhaps offering a distracted remark about how I should try a different moisturizer because the lab air was making my skin look dull. But when Skylar managed to post a TikTok that received 10,000 likes, my father would beam with a visceral fatherly pride, discussing her potential as an influencer as if she had just brokered a peace treaty. He spoke of her future in terms of visibility and fame, while mine was treated as a gritty, utilitarian inevitability that required no encouragement. He saw Skylar as a mirror that reflected his own success back to the world in a beautiful, shimmering light, whereas I was merely the structural support in the basement, necessary perhaps, but unrefined and best kept out of sight during cocktail parties. Every morning at 4 a.m., as I sat in the silence of the propulsion lab with the hum of the ventilation system as my only companion, I would think about that $64,000. It was my shield. It was the reason I didn't complain when Skylar got a new pair of $700 Christian Louboutin heels for a random Tuesday lunch. It was the reason I could stomach the sight of the $820 monthly lease payment appearing on the family's shared financial dashboard while I was counting pennies for a Subway sandwich. I told myself that I was building something permanent while she was building something fleeting. I told myself that once I finished those final 14 credits and transitioned into my master's, the spreadsheets would finally balance in my favor. I had calculated the cost of every credit hour at Georgia Tech, the cost of the specialized software like MATLAB and SolidWorks, and the cost of a modest apartment near the North Avenue corridor. My grandfather's trust was the variable that made the entire equation work. He was the only one who understood that while Skylar was the face of the family, I was the mind, and the mind needed resources to thrive. I remember a specific evening, just 3 weeks before the semester started, when the air in Atlanta was thick with the suffocating humidity of late August. I was sitting at the kitchen island, my laptop open to a complex spreadsheet titled Fall 2024 Budget, meticulously verifying that my $64,250 would cover the projected 3% increase in tuition fees. My father walked in, still smelling of the expensive scotch he'd enjoyed at his club, and stood over my shoulder. He didn't ask how my research was going or if I was excited for my senior year. Instead, he pointed at a line item for a $500 specialized aerospace textbook and let out a short, mocking huff of air. "You really spend so much on these things, Addison," he said, his voice dripping with a condescending pity that felt like a slap. "Skylar just found a way to get her books for free from a friend. She's so resourceful." I didn't tell him that Skylar's books were mostly glossy introductory texts that she never opened, while mine were technical manuals that held the keys to my professional licensing. I just clicked the save icon on my spreadsheet, feeling the weight of the silver ring my grandfather had given me pressing against my finger. I felt secure in my silence. I felt protected by the math. But math, as I would soon learn, is only as reliable as the people who control the variables. I believed that because the money was in a trust, because it was a legal entity tied to my name and my grandfather's final wishes, it was an immovable object. I didn't account for the fact that my father was the executor, a man who viewed the word trust not as a legal obligation, but as a suggestion for his own convenience. While I was wearing my $40 sneakers and working $15.50 an hour to prove my worth through labor, he was looking at my $64,000 as a stagnant pool of capital that could be better utilized to maintain the shiny, polished exterior of the Prescott brand. He saw Skylar's mounting legal fees from her reckless driving incident and her ballooning credit card debt as an emergency that required an immediate infusion of cash. He didn't see my education as an investment. He saw it as an expense that could be deferred, or better yet, deleted. The hyper-realism of my life, the exactness of my lab hours, the specific wear on my shoes, the precise balance of my savings, was all part of a blueprint I had designed to ensure I would never have to rely on a man who valued a BMW lease over a daughter's degree. I had done everything right. I had been the diligent daughter, the high achiever, the one who caused no trouble and asked for nothing but what was already hers. I had sacrificed the typical college experience for the sake of long-term stability. And yet, as I sat there that night, looking at my spreadsheet, I had no idea that the numbers were already lies. I didn't know that the $64,250 was already gone, reallocated into the engine of Skylar's white BMW and the silk of my father's ties. I was living in a world of precise details, while my family was living in a world of grand, expensive illusions, and the collision between the two was going to be more violent than any failed propulsion test I had ever witnessed in the lab. I was an aerospace engineer in training, someone who understood that even the smallest fracture in a pressurized cabin could lead to a total catastrophic failure at high altitude. But I had failed to see the cracks forming in the foundation of my own home. I thought my grandfather's legacy was a fortress, but in the hands of my father, it was just another asset to be liquidated in favor of the golden child. The spreadsheets were perfect, the math was flawless, but the human element, the sheer, unadulterated greed and favoritism of Julian Prescott, was the one variable I had never factored into my code, and it was the one that was about to destroy everything I had built. At exactly 10:22 p.m. on a Tuesday night, while the rest of the world seemed to be settling into the quiet rhythms of sleep, my entire reality collapsed into a single line of digital text on a glowing smartphone screen. I was sitting at my scarred wooden desk in my cramped apartment, the air smelling of cold coffee and the ozone from my overworked laptop, when I decided to log into my Chase mobile banking app to verify that my rent check for next month would clear without issue. I expected to see the comforting, solid weight of $64,000, the sum of my grandfather's legacy, and my own grueling labor. But instead, the screen refreshed to reveal a number so small, it felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus. Total balance, $114.12. For several long, agonizing seconds, the blood in my veins turned to ice, and my heart did not just drop. It completely stopped beating as I stared at the transaction history in a state of clinical shock. There it was, a massive, jagged hole in my future. A wire transfer for $64,000, executed just hours earlier, labeled simply as a domestic transfer to an external account. My father, Marcus Prescott, had used the ghost of his old cosigner access from when I was 16 years old, a vestige of childhood I had never thought to remove because I foolishly believed in the sanctity of paternal protection, to drain every cent of my life savings. He hadn't just taken money, he had reached into my chest and pulled out my heartbeat, and I knew exactly where that money had gone before I even saw the recipient's name. The rage that followed the shock was a cold, vibrating force that propelled me out of my chair and toward the door, without a second thought for my own safety or the late hour. I didn't grab a jacket. I just snatched my keys and sprinted to the parking lot where my 2012 silver Honda Civic was sitting under a street lamp, its paint peeling slightly on the hood from years of exposure to the relentless Georgia sun. As I pulled out of the complex, a sudden violent rainstorm erupted over Atlanta, the kind of torrential downpour that turns the asphalt into a slick black mirror and reduces visibility to a few flickering yards of blurred taillights. My car, which had over 140,000 miles on the odometer, began to shake violently as I pushed it past 65 miles per hour on the flooded interstate, the windshield wipers struggling at their highest setting to clear the sheets of water. Every rattle of the dashboard and every shudder of the steering wheel felt like an echo of my own internal disintegration. But I didn't slow down because the thought of my $64,000 being used to buy someone else's unearned luxury was a goad in my side. I drove with a white-knuckled grip, my vision tunneled on the path toward the affluent suburbs of Buckhead, toward the house that was supposed to be a home but had become a crime scene. When I finally screeched into the circular driveway of my parents' estate, the house looked like a serene fortress of wealth, its exterior spotlights casting a warm, inviting glow on the manicured hedges and the white 2023 BMW 4 Series that sat parked like a trophy in the garage. I didn't knock. I used my old key and burst through the heavy mahogany front door, bringing the scent of wet asphalt and desperation into the pristine, climate-controlled foyer. The interior of the house smelled of an opulence that made my stomach turn, the rich, buttery aroma of expensive Wagyu steak that had clearly been the center of a celebratory dinner I wasn't invited to. I followed the sound of a television and the low murmur of conversation into the living room, where the atmosphere was so domestic and casual that it felt like an insult to the tragedy I was carrying. My mother, Eleanor, was reclined on a cream-colored velvet sofa, her face illuminated by the clinical blue light of her iPad as she scrolled through a digital catalog of high-end home decor. And she didn't even bother to look up when I entered the room, dripping wet and trembling with a fury I could no longer contain. My father was standing by the wet bar, swirling a 2-finger pour of Macallan 18 into a crystal glass that probably cost more than my monthly utility bill, and his expression wasn't one of guilt, but of mild annoyance that his evening had been interrupted. I demanded to know how he could do it, how he could steal the money my grandfather specifically left for my master's degree, but his response was delivered with the casual indifference of a man who was merely moving pawns on a chessboard. "Skylar needed the boost, Addison," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of any paternal warmth as he explained that the $64,000 had been wired to cover the full tuition and housing for my sister at a private fashion institute in New York that she had decided to attend on a whim. He spoke about Skylar's creative potential and the importance of prestige, as if my aerospace engineering degree was a hobby I could simply put on a shelf, while her desire to study luxury branding was a mission of national importance. My mother finally looked up, but not to offer comfort. Instead, she sighed with a patronizing exhaustion, telling me that I was the smart one and that I would inevitably find a way to make it work. She suggested, with a chilling lack of empathy, that I should just apply for a high-interest private loan or find a second job, as if the 25 hours I already spent in the lab were a vacation. The most agonizing part of the entire tableau was Skylar herself, who was perched on a leather ottoman like a queen on a throne, seemingly oblivious to the fact that her new life was being built on the ruins of mine. She was wearing a brand-new, oversized $1,200 black Balenciaga hoodie with the logo boldly embroidered across the chest, the fabric looking thick and soft against her skin, a stark contrast to my soaked, threadbare Georgia Tech sweatshirt. In her hand, she held a large Starbucks matcha latte, the $9 green liquid swirled with oat milk, and as I stood there screaming for my future, she took a slow, deliberate sip and let a small, cruel smirk play across her lips. That smirk was the final confirmation that this wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a coordinated hit, a family decision that I was the one who could be sacrificed because I was strong enough to survive the loss. They were using my resilience as a weapon against me, penalizing my competence to reward her failures, and the injustice of it felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I looked at my father, who was now meticulously wiping a stray drop of water from the polished marble countertop where I had leaned, and realized that to them, I wasn't a daughter. I was a resource to be mined. They saw my $64,000 not as my property, but as a family asset that had been incorrectly allocated to someone who didn't need the help because I was already successful. My sister's smirk widened as she checked a notification on her iPhone 15 Pro Max, likely a message about her upcoming move to a luxury loft in Manhattan, and the sheer, unadulterated greed of the scene made the air in the room feel too thin to breathe. I was 22 years old, 14 credits away from a life-changing degree, and I was standing in a house that smelled of Wagyu and sandalwood, realizing that my bank account held exactly $114.12 because the people who gave me life had decided to rob me of my future. The rain continued to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows, a rhythmic drumming that sounded like the ticking of a clock I could no longer stop. And as I looked at my mother's disinterested face and my sister's designer hoodie, I knew that the bridge behind me wasn't just burning, it had been detonated. I didn't stay to hear them justify it any further because there is no logic that can explain away the theft of a child's dream to fund a sibling's whim. I turned and walked back out into the storm, the heavy front door clicking shut behind me with a finality that echoed in the empty spaces of my heart. And as I got back into my shaking Honda Civic, I felt a strange, cold clarity settle over me. The $114.12 in my account was a joke, a pittance that wouldn't even cover the cost of the textbooks I needed for the upcoming Monday, but the realization that I owed these people nothing was a wealth I hadn't possessed an hour ago. My father had used his access to my past to steal my future, but in doing so, he had inadvertently severed the last tether of guilt that had kept me trying to earn his approval. As I backed out of the driveway, the headlights of my old car cutting through the sheets of rain, I looked one last time at the white BMW and the glowing windows of the Prescott Manor, and I promised myself that I would find a way to finish those 14 credits if I had to bleed for every single one of them. They thought they had reallocated an asset, but they had actually ignited a fuse, and as I drove away from the smell of Wagyu and the sight of Balenciaga, I began to calculate a new equation, one where the only variables that mattered were my own intellect and the absolute, unwavering resolve to ensure that this was the last thing they ever took from me. The spreadsheets were gone, the trust was broken, and the path ahead was a dark, flooded highway. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for a reflection of myself in my father's eyes. I was looking for the horizon. I sat in the driver's seat of my shaking 2012 Honda Civic for 2 full hours, parked just at the edge of the shadows cast by the massive, meticulously manicured oak trees that lined my parents' driveway in Buckhead. The rain had slowed from a violent deluge to a rhythmic, steady drumming against the metal roof, creating a hollow, metallic sound that echoed the emptiness growing inside my own chest. The interior of the car began to grow cold as I turned off the engine to save what little fuel remained in the tank, and soon my own ragged, warm breath began to fog up the windshield, turning the brightly lit windows of the Prescott mansion into blurred, golden smudges of light. I reached into the back seat and grabbed a yellow legal pad and a pressurized space pen, tools of my trade that usually held the blueprints for hydraulic systems or propulsion calculations, and I flipped to a clean, stark page. I needed to see the data of my life laid out with the same clinical objectivity I applied to a structural failure analysis, because I realized that my emotions were currently a noise floor that was drowning out the signal of the truth. I drew a thick, unwavering line down the center of the yellow paper, creating 2 distinct columns that would represent the 2 irreconcilable worlds I was currently straddling. On the left side, I wrote the heading Family Loyalty in a script that felt increasingly heavy and archaic, and on the right side, I wrote grandfather's will and legal precedent in the sharp, disciplined block letters of an engineer. Under the left column, I tried to list the entries for why I should stay, why I should forgive, and what I actually owed the people inside that house. But the page remained mockingly blank as I realized that every memory of loyalty was actually a memory of my own silence and subjugation. I looked at the words family loyalty and saw them for what they truly were in the Prescott household. A euphemism for my role as the invisible safety net, the dependable daughter who didn't cost anything and didn't demand attention, allowing all the resources to be funneled toward the golden child. I realized in that cold, fogged-up cabin that my family was not a support system or a sanctuary, but a small, exclusive group of people who viewed my existence as an unpaid insurance policy against their own poor decisions. They assumed that because I was the smart one, the one with the 3.9 GPA, and the work ethic that kept me in the lab until 4 a.m., I would always find a way to fix the problems they created. They had reallocated my $64,000 because they believed my future was a renewable resource that I could simply rebuild through more suffering, while Skylar's fragile ego required the immediate protection of a private fashion institute and a luxury lifestyle. The injustice of being penalized for my own competence settled into my bones with a freezing clarity that was far more powerful than the anger I had felt only an hour before. I shifted my focus to the right column, the one titled Grandfather's Will and Legal Precedent, and I began to list the facts of the trust and the specific language Nana Grace and Grandpa had used when they discussed my education. I remembered the exact texture of the blue ink signature on the trust documents I had seen years ago, and I recalled the specific clauses regarding the fiduciary duty of the executor, a role my father was currently violating with the casual arrogance of a man who thought he was above the law. I didn't cry because tears are a reaction to a loss you cannot quantify, and I was currently quantifying every single cent and every single betrayal with the precision of a forensic accountant. I felt a strange, detached sensation, as if I were observing my own life from a high altitude, watching the version of Addison who played by the rules and waited for her turn slowly dissolve into the mist on the windshield. That girl was dead, drowned in a rainstorm in a driveway in Buckhead, and the person who was left was a woman who understood that in a world governed by power and optics, the only way to survive is to change the variables of the game. The golden glow from the dining room window was sharp enough to pierce through the gathering fog, and I watched as the silhouettes of my parents and Skylar moved with a fluid, effortless grace that only comes from a total lack of consequence. My father, Marcus, was standing near the sideboard, his $450 Ferragamo tie loosened just slightly at the collar, while he used a silver foil cutter to open a bottle of $140 Veuve Clicquot Le Grand Dame. I could almost hear the muted pop of the cork and the effervescent hiss of the bubbles as he poured the pale gold liquid into 3 crystal flutes, celebrating a victory that had been bought with my sweat and my grandfather's legacy. They weren't mourning the loss of my degree or the fact that they had just bankrupted their eldest daughter's dreams. They were laughing, their shoulders shaking with a mirth that felt like a physical assault against my senses. Skylar was still wearing that $1,200 Balenciaga hoodie, the heavy fabric bunched around her elbows as she raised her glass in a toast to her new life in Manhattan, a life built on the ruins of the 14 credits I was supposed to finish this spring. I felt a cold, calculated impulse take hold of me, a digital reflex born of a generation that knows that if a moment isn't recorded, it didn't happen. I pulled out my iPhone 15, a device I had paid for myself through 16 months of overtime in the lab, and I wiped a small circular portal into the fog on the driver's side window. I opened the camera app and switched it to video mode, focusing the lens on the scene of domestic betrayal playing out just 30 feet away in the warmth of the dining room. I hit the red record button and captured exactly 15 seconds of footage. My father laughing as he topped off Skylar's glass, my mother clinking her flute against theirs with a smile that never reached her eyes, and the label of the expensive champagne glinting under the chandelier. It was a 15-second documentary of a theft disguised as a family dinner, a visual record of the moment they decided that my life was worth less than a bottle of Veuve Clicquot and a fashion degree. I watched the recording back, the tiny screen of the phone showing the vibrant, saturated colors of their celebration against the dark, grainy reality of my car's interior, and I felt a grim satisfaction. This wasn't a memory anymore. It was evidence, a data point that I would store in the same folder as my tuition receipts and my grandfather's trust documents. As the video looped on my screen, I looked back at my yellow legal pad, specifically at the column on the right, Legal Precedent. I began to write down the names of the law firms my father's company used and the names of the board members he spent his weekends trying to impress at the golf course. I realized that Marcus Prescott's greatest fear wasn't the loss of a daughter's love, but the loss of his reputation as a man of integrity and financial brilliance. He had reallocated my assets because he thought I was a silent variable, a number that could be moved without changing the outcome of the equation. He didn't realize that when you take everything from someone who has been trained to understand the mechanics of force and pressure, you don't just leave them with nothing, you leave them with nothing to lose. The $64,000 was gone from the Chase app, but the paper trail of the wire transfer remained, a digital breadcrumb that led directly from my grandfather's intent to Skylar's unearned tuition. I felt the weight of my $40 New Balance sneakers on the floor mat, the fabric still damp from the run to the car, and I realized that these shoes had walked more miles of honest work than my father had in a decade. The house was a fortress of brick and mortar, valued at $2.4 million according to the latest tax assessment I had looked up out of pure curiosity months ago. But I saw it now as a structure with a fatal flaw in its foundation. My father had built his life on the idea that he could control every narrative, but he had forgotten that I was the one who spent my nights studying the way things break under stress. I sat there in the silence, the yellow legal pad glowing faintly in the light of my phone, and I didn't feel the need to scream or bang on the door again. The time for emotional appeals was over, replaced by the cold, hard logic of a counter-strategy. I would find a way to pay for those 14 credits, even if it meant taking the high-interest loans my mother so casually suggested. But I would do it with the full knowledge that I was no longer a Prescott. I was an independent entity, a satellite that had finally broken free of a decaying orbit, and the 15-second video on my phone was the first piece of telemetry I would use to navigate my way back to the stars. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the driveway slick and shimmering under the moonlight, and I watched as the lights in the dining room flickered off, the celebration moving to another part of the house where I was no longer welcome. I put the yellow legal pad into my backpack, tucking it next to my fluid dynamics textbook, and I gripped the steering wheel with a steady, unwavering hand. My bank account said $114.12, but my mind was already calculating the interest on the debt my father now owed me, a debt that couldn't be settled with a wire transfer or a hollow apology. As I backed the Honda Civic out of the driveway, the tires crunching softly on the gravel, I didn't look back at the mansion. I looked at the road ahead, a dark ribbon of asphalt that led away from the Wagyu steak and the $140 champagne toward a future that would be entirely of my own making. Family isn't blood. It isn't a shared last name or a seat at a celebratory table. Family is the people who don't steal your wings while you're still trying to learn how to fly. And as I drove into the night, I knew that I was finally going to find out who my real family was, even if I had to search every corner of the sky to find them. The spreadsheets were being rewritten, the variables were shifting, and for the first time in my 22 years, the math of my life was finally starting to make sense. The next morning, at exactly 9 o'clock sharp, as the sun began to burn through the lingering gray mist of the previous night's storm and cast long, sharp shadows across the glass and steel canyons of the financial district, I walked into the prestigious offices of Sterling and Associates. The lobby was a masterclass in intimidation and old money aesthetics, smelling deeply of expensive hand-polished mahogany, the subtle metallic tang of high-end air filtration systems, and the rich, dark aroma of triple-shot espresso wafting from the glass-walled break room. I was still wearing my faded Georgia Tech hoodie and my worn-out New Balance sneakers, but I carried my yellow legal pad and my laptop with the focus of someone walking into a strategic command center rather than a law office. My lawyer, Sarah Jenkins, a woman whose reputation for surgical precision in estate law was well known in the Atlanta legal circles, was already waiting for me in a conference room that overlooked the city's skyline. She didn't offer a patronizing smile or a shallow apology for my situation. Instead, she pulled out the original 2015 notarized trust deed that I had managed to secure from my grandfather's old safe deposit box and began to spread the documents across the dark wood table with a pair of gloved hands as if she were handling ancient, volatile artifacts. As Sarah's eyes moved across the dense, legalistic prose of the documents, her expression shifted from professional curiosity to a cold, sharpened intensity that made my heart hammer against my ribs. She pointed a silver fountain pen at a specific subsection on the 4th page, a clause that my father had clearly gambled on me never reading or understanding in my grief-stricken haze following my grandfather's passing. My grandfather, a man of engineering and foresight, hadn't just left a simple pot of money for me to spend as I pleased. He had established what Sarah described as a restricted educational covenant, a highly specific and legally ironclad set of parameters designed to ensure his legacy was used to advance the hard sciences. The covenant explicitly stated that the funds were to be used solely for the pursuit of a degree in a STEM field, science, technology, engineering, or mathematics, at a Tier 1 accredited research institution, with a secondary provision that any unauthorized diversion of the principal for non-STEM or non-accredited purposes would constitute a terminal breach of fiduciary duty. By moving that $64,000 to a non-STEM, non-accredited fashion institute in New York for a third party like Schuyler, my father hadn't just been mean or biased, and he hadn't just participated in a typical family squabble over assets. He had committed a felony, specifically a deliberate act of fiduciary fraud and embezzlement of trust assets, a crime that carried significant prison time and mandatory restitution under Georgia state law. The realization that my father's arrogance had led him into a trap of his own making began to settle over me, replacing my despair with a cold, analytical resolve that I recognized from my most difficult engineering labs. Sarah and I began the painstaking process of gathering the digital breadcrumbs that my father, in his haste and sense of invincibility, had left scattered across the internet like a trail of neon signs pointing toward his guilt. We pulled the detailed transaction logs from my Chase banking app, highlighting the 10:18 p.m. domestic wire transfer ID that served as the digital fingerprint for the theft, and then we cross-referenced the technical metadata provided by the bank's security department. The most damning piece of evidence was the IP address used to authorize the transfer, which Sarah quickly confirmed through a subpoenaed log was a direct match for the static IP address assigned to my father's home office in Buckhead, the very room where he had likely sat with his glass of Macallan 18 while he methodically dismantled my future. We documented the specific timestamp of the transfer, noting how it occurred less than an hour after I had confronted him, proving a level of premeditated malice that would be devastating in a courtroom. We also secured a copy of the Fashion Institute's tuition invoice that Skylar had foolishly posted a partial screenshot of on her public Instagram story. A 2024 white-label fashion program with a price tag of exactly $64,000 for the first 3 semesters. A program that was famously unaccredited and focused more on social networking than academic rigor. Every document we added to the file, every printed email, and every notarized affidavit felt like a brick being added to a wall that was slowly closing in on Julian Prescott's legacy of lies. I sat there in the mahogany-scented silence, watching as Sarah used a high-speed scanner to digitize the original 2015 deed, the bright green light of the scanner passing over my grandfather's signature like a searching eye. I thought about the contrast between this room and the dining room from the night before. There were no champagne toasts here, no laughter, and no $1,200 hoodies, just the cold, hard reality of the law and the mathematical certainty of a fraud that was about to be exposed. Sarah looked at me over the rims of her glasses, her voice dropping to a low, steady tone as she explained that we weren't just going to ask for the money back. We were going to file for an emergency injunction to freeze my father's personal and corporate accounts until the trust was fully restored with interest. The hyper-realism of the moment was almost overwhelming. The way the dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight hitting the legal folders, the subtle clicking of Sarah's keyboard as she drafted the initial complaint, and the weight of the silver ring on my finger that felt like it was glowing with my grandfather's approval. I realized then that my father's biggest mistake wasn't just stealing the money. It was forgetting that he had raised a daughter who was trained to look for structural weaknesses, someone who understood that even the most impressive-looking skyscraper would collapse if the internal supports were compromised. He had seen the trust as a family asset to be reallocated, but I saw it as a specialized machine with a very specific operating manual, and he had just jammed a crowbar into the gears while the engine was running at full throttle. We spent the next 4 hours refining the evidence, building a timeline that was so precise it left no room for the clerical error defense his lawyers would undoubtedly try to mount. We included the cost of the high-interest loan I would have to take out in the interim, calculated at a predatory 11.49% APR, and the projected loss of income if my graduation was delayed by even a single semester, a figure that reached into the hundreds of thousands when factoring in a starting salary at a firm like Boeing or Lockheed Martin. Sarah's paralegal, a sharp-eyed man named David, brought in a fresh tray of coffee in ceramic mugs that clinked against the table, a sound that felt like the tolling of a bell for my father's reputation. As I sipped the bitter, hot liquid, I felt a sense of liberation that I hadn't expected. I was no longer the girl in the shaking Honda Civic. I was the primary plaintiff in a felony-level fraud case, and the data was entirely on my side. The legal precedent for what my father had done was documented in a thick, leather-bound volume that Sarah kept on her desk. And as she read aloud the rulings of previous cases where executors had been stripped of their titles and forced to pay triple damages, I felt the last of my guilt wither away. My father had chosen a 2023 BMW and a Manhattan fashion degree over his own daughter's career in the stars, and in doing so, he had handed me the very tools I needed to strip him of the prestige he valued above all else. He thought he was playing a game of social optics where he could simply reallocate my value, but he was actually playing a game of legal chess against an engineer who had already mapped out every possible move until checkmate. As I walked out of the office at 1:30 p.m., the Atlanta heat was starting to settle over the pavement, and the noise of the city felt vibrant and full of possibility for the first time in years. My bank account still said $114.12, but in my backpack, I carried the digital and physical evidence that would eventually turn that number into a settlement that would ensure I never had to worry about tuition again. I drove my silver Honda Civic back toward Georgia Tech, the engine still rattling but the steering wheel feeling steady in my hands, and I realized that the 14 credits I was worried about were just a minor calculation in a much larger project. Family loyalty had been the left column of my legal pad, a blank space where love was supposed to be, but the right column, the law, the truth, and my grandfather's specific engineering-focused intent was filled to the margins with the evidence of my own worth. I looked up through the windshield at the clear blue sky, the same sky I intended to build rockets for, and I knew that the flight path had changed, but the destination remained the same. My father had tried to ground me by stealing my fuel, but he didn't realize that a restricted educational covenant is a self-repairing system when triggered by a breach. The mahogany and espresso of the law office were the new scents of my life, a professional atmosphere where facts mattered more than favorites, and where reallocation was just another word for a crime that was about to be punished. I was Addison Prescott, and while I was still exactly 14 credits away from my degree, I was now only hours away from filing the papers that would prove to the world that my father's $450 Ferragamo tie was just a noose he had tied around his own neck. The digital breadcrumbs were gathered, the IP addresses were locked, and the 2015 notarized deed was now a weapon in the hands of a woman who had finally learned that the only person she ever needed to impress was the one staring back at her in the rearview mirror. 3 weeks of strategic silence had passed since I walked out of the offices of Sterling and Associates, 3 weeks where I lived on protein bars and the adrenaline of a coming storm. And now, the night of the Prescott Annual Charity Gala had finally arrived at the Grand Heights Hotel in downtown Atlanta. The air was crisp and carried the scent of coming rain, but inside the rented ballroom on the 34th floor, the atmosphere was one of suffocating opulence and curated perfection, illuminated by 3 massive Austrian crystal chandeliers that cast a shimmering, fractured light over 120 guests dressed in black tie attire. I knew from the intercepted planning emails that the catering bill for this single evening was exactly $18,500, featuring a menu of lobster tail medallions and prime-aged ribeye that was being served on fine bone china, while my own refrigerator at home held nothing but half a carton of eggs and a bottle of tap water. My father, Julian Prescott, was currently standing on the elevated mahogany stage at the front of the room, looking every bit the pillar of the community in a custom-tailored tuxedo that must have cost $5,000, his voice booming through the professional-grade sound system as he bragged about his family values and the bright, shimmering future of his youngest daughter, Skylar. He spoke of Skylar's upcoming move to Manhattan and her prestigious placement at a private fashion institute as if it were a triumph of her own merit, and not a crime funded by the systematic dismantling of my own life's work. I arrived at the grand double doors of the ballroom at exactly 8:45 p.m., a time when the first course had been cleared and the wine was flowing freely enough to lower the guests' inhibitions, but not so much that they would lose their focus on the spectacle I was about to provide. I was not wearing the silk gown or the pearls my mother had once suggested for such events. Instead, I was draped in the heavy polyester weight of my black graduation gown, the one they had told me I would have to delay wearing for years because the money for my degree had been reallocated. The sight of the mortarboard cap on my head and the gold engineering tassel dangling against my cheek felt like a suit of armor as I pushed past the bewildered greeters who were too stunned by my attire to ask for an invitation. I wasn't carrying a gift for my father's charity, nor was I carrying the resentment that had nearly drowned me in my car 3 weeks ago. I was carrying a stack of 120 manila envelopes, one for every single guest sitting at those circular tables draped in white linen and adorned with $400 floral centerpieces. As I began to move through the room with the methodical, calculated gait of someone executing a well-rehearsed structural test, the room began to fall into a jagged, uneven silence that rippled outward from my path. My father was mid-sentence, talking about the importance of legacy and the responsibility of the successful to shepherd the next generation, when he finally saw me standing near table 4, where 3 of his biggest corporate clients were sitting with their wives. I didn't say a word to him. I simply reached into my bag and placed a manila envelope directly onto the gold-rimmed charger plate of a senior partner at a rival wealth management firm, nodding once before moving to the next table. Inside each envelope was a high-resolution color printout of the 10:18 p.m. wire transfer ASI, the IP address tracing the theft back to my father's home office, and a copy of the restricted educational covenant from my grandfather's notarized trust deed that explicitly prohibited the use of those funds for non-STEM education. I had also included a QR code that linked directly to the 15-second video I had recorded from the driveway, showing my father and Skylar toasted their success with $140 Veuve Clicquot while the ink on the fraudulent transfer was still wet. The hyper-realism of the scene was intoxicating. The sound of 120 envelopes being torn open simultaneously sounded like the fluttering of wings, a dry, paper-thin noise that completely drowned out the ambient jazz music playing in the background. I watched as my mother, Eleanor, froze in her seat at the head table, her hand trembling so violently that her wine glass clinked against her diamond tennis bracelet, her face turning a shade of pale that no amount of expensive foundation could mask. My father's voice faltered and then died in his throat as he realized that the documents being passed around the room weren't a tribute to his career, but a forensic map of his felony. I reached Skylar's table, where she sat surrounded by her socialite friends, wearing a new dress that probably cost more than my car, and I placed the final envelope directly in front of her Starbucks-scented hands. She looked up at me with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning terror, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of a confrontation. I simply adjusted my graduation cap and continued my walk toward the stage where my father stood, now looking small and exposed under the harsh glare of the spotlights. The smell of the room had changed from the rich aroma of seared steak to the metallic, sharp scent of fear and the ozone-like charge of a public scandal unfolding in real time. I could see the guests whispering, their eyes darting from the legal documents in their hands to the man on the stage who had just been exposed as a common thief of his own daughter's inheritance. One of my father's longest-standing business associates, a man who prided himself on his own ethical rigidity, stood up and looked at the wire transfer confirmation with a grimace of pure disgust before looking up at the stage. The $18,500 catering was a waste now, as the guests were no longer interested in the lobster. They were consuming the wreckage of the Prescott reputation with a much hungrier intensity. I reached the base of the stairs leading to the podium and stood there, my black gown billowing slightly in the draft from the air conditioning, looking directly into my father's eyes for the first time in weeks without the need for his approval or the fear of his rejection. I saw the moment his brain processed the legal implications of the restricted educational covenant being in the hands of his entire professional network, the moment he realized that by stealing $64,000, he had cost himself millions in future contracts and a lifetime of social standing. He tried to speak, his hand reaching for the microphone to perhaps offer a joke or a dismissal, but the silence in the room was now absolute and heavy, a physical weight that made his every movement seem sluggish and guilty. I realized then that while they had seen me as an insurance policy, I had always been the architect of my own escape, and this gala was the final demolition of the prison they had tried to build around my potential. My father looked down at his $450 Ferragamo tie, the same one he had adjusted so carefully while telling me I had no future, and he finally had the decency to look away, his shoulders slumping as the first murmur of fiduciary fraud began to circulate through the back of the room like a virus. I stood in the center of the ballroom, a girl in a cheap graduation gown surrounded by the elite of Atlanta, and I felt a profound sense of peace because the math of the night was finally perfect. The theft had been recorded, the evidence had been distributed, and the reallocation of my life was officially being reversed by the court of public opinion before the actual court even opened its doors on Monday morning. I hadn't brought a gift because the truth was the only thing anyone in this room was going to take home with them, a permanent stain on the Prescott name that no amount of charity or champagne could ever wash away. As I turned to walk back out the double doors, leaving the manila envelopes like tombstones on every table, I felt the weight of the 14 credits I still had to earn. But for the first time, I knew the path to them was clear of his shadow. The elevator ride down to the lobby was silent, the gold-leafed mirrors reflecting a woman who no longer looked like the tired lab assistant in the $40 New Balance sneakers, but like an engineer who had just successfully tested the structural integrity of her own soul and found it unbreakable. Behind me, the 34th floor was in chaos, the sounds of shouting and chair legs scraping against the floor echoing down the hallway as the Prescott annual charity gala ended not with a toast, but with a mass exodus of people who didn't want to be associated with a felon. I walked out into the cool Atlanta night, the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement in long, shimmering ribbons of gold, and I took a deep breath of the damp, honest air. My bank account still said $114.12, but as I got into my 2012 Honda Civic and started the engine, I knew that the $64,000 was already on its way back to me, along with the dignity my father had tried so hard to steal. The variables had been corrected, the equation was balanced, and as I drove away from the Grand Heights Hotel, I realized that I wasn't just wearing a graduation gown. I was wearing the first day of the rest of my life, and this time, I was the one who had decided the cost of the admission. The silence that swallowed the ballroom of the Grand Heights Hotel was not the polite, expectant hush of an audience waiting for a heartfelt tribute, but a heavy, pressurized vacuum that felt as though the very oxygen had been sucked out of the room by the sheer audacity of my presence. I walked with a measured, rhythmic stride toward the center of the stage, the hem of my black graduation gown whispering against the polished hardwood floor, a sound that seemed to echo like thunder in the absolute stillness of 120 stunned guests. My father, Marcus, stood frozen beside the mahogany podium, his hand still curled around a half-empty glass of vintage champagne, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and a rapidly dawning horror as I stepped directly into the pool of white light cast by the overhead spots. I didn't wait for an invitation or a nod of acknowledgement. I reached out and took the cold silver microphone from the stand, the slight screech of feedback piercing through the room like a warning siren. "I'd like to thank my father for his reallocation strategy," I said, my voice projected through the high-fidelity Bose surround sound system with a clarity and a coldness that felt as sharp as a scalpel. I paused for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to see the beads of sweat beginning to break out across my father's brow, and then I turned my head slightly toward the back of the darkened room where the AV tech booth was tucked behind a velvet curtain. I gave a sharp, deliberate nod to the technician, a friend from the Georgia Tech Engineering Department whom I had paid $200 in cash to bypass the gala's pre-programmed itinerary and swap the sentimental family slideshow for the file I had provided. In an instant, the giant 15-foot projection screen that dominated the wall behind the stage flickered, And instead of the curated photos of Skylar's childhood or my parents' vacations in the Maldives, the room was bathed in the harsh blue-white glare of a bank statement. The text was massive, every character crisp and undeniable, showing the high-resolution scan of my Chase account history, minus $64,000. To Skylar Prescott, unauthorized wire transfer. Beneath the transaction, I had included the technical metadata Sarah and I had gathered, including the specific IP address and the timestamp that proved the theft had occurred while I was begging for my future in that very same house. The gasp that rippled through the front row was visceral, led by a woman in a shimmering sequined gown whose silver fork clattered against her fine bone china plate with a sharp, discordant ring that seemed to break the spell of the room's paralysis. I didn't stop at the visual evidence because an engineer knows that redundancy is the key to a successful system, and I intended for my father's reputation to have 0 points of recovery. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown and pulled out the first of the thick manila envelopes, stepping off the stage and walking directly to the table where my father's primary business partner, a man who controlled the lion's share of his firm's institutional capital, sat with his mouth agape. I placed the envelope directly onto his silk napkin, the weight of the legal documents making a solid, satisfying thud that was audible to everyone nearby. Inside that envelope was not a greeting card or a charity pledge, but a complete copy of the civil lawsuit I had filed that afternoon for fiduciary embezzlement and a formal cease and desist order that legally prohibited my father from touching another cent of the Prescott Trust. As the partner pulled out the documents and began to scan the first page, his expression shifted from bewilderment to a cold, professional fury that I knew would translate into the immediate termination of their 20-year partnership. The hyper-realism of the moment was etched into my brain like a blueprint. The smell of the wilting $400 lilies on the tables, the sound of 100 guests murmuring in a low, frantic drone that sounded like a hive of disturbed hornets, and the sight of my father's face as it underwent a violent chemical transformation. He went from the healthy, vibrant tan of a man who spends his weekends at the golf club to a sickly, ashen gray, the color of wet concrete or a dying star. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but the microphone was still in my hand, and the screen behind him continued to radiate the undeniable proof of his felony. Skylar, who had been the picture of designer-clad arrogance only moments ago, looked as though she wanted to dissolve into her $1,200 Balenciaga hoodie, her eyes darting toward the exits as she realized that her Manhattan loft and her unearned fashion degree were evaporating in the heat of the projector lamp. My mother, Eleanor, sat motionless, her hand still hovering over her wine glass as if she were trying to pretend that this was all a very elaborate, very realistic piece of performance art rather than the public disintegration of the Prescott name. I turned back to the room, the gold tassel of my engineering cap swaying with the movement, and I felt a sense of power that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the truth. My father had spent 22 years treating me like a calculation he could always balance in his favor, an asset he could reallocate to suit the optics of his preferred daughter. But he had failed to account for the fact that I was the one who understood the mechanics of the structure. I had spent my nights in the lab studying the way materials fail under extreme stress, and tonight I had simply applied that knowledge to the fragile, hollow foundation of his integrity. The $18,500 that had been spent on the catering was a sunk cost now. The lobster tail medallions sat untouched on plates as the guests were far more interested in the forensic evidence being displayed on the 15-foot screen. I saw a local journalist, someone invited to cover the charity aspect of the evening, frantically typing notes into a smartphone, and I knew that by the time the sun rose over Atlanta, the Prescott brand would be synonymous with fiduciary fraud rather than family values. The air in the ballroom felt heavy and charged with the scent of ozone and expensive perfume, a cloying mixture that made the back of my throat itch. But I stood my ground at the edge of the stage, watching as the first few guests began to stand up and walk toward the exit without a word of goodbye. They were people of status, people who understood that a public scandal of this magnitude was a contagious thing, and they had no intention of being caught in the fallout of Julian Prescott's legal catastrophe. My father finally found his voice, a weak, trembling sound that barely carried past the first row, as he muttered something about a misunderstanding, but no one was listening to him anymore. Their eyes were fixed on the screen, on the specific, unchangeable number of $64,000, and on the legal headers of the lawsuit that identified him as a defendant in a felony-level embezzlement case. I felt the weight of my $40 New Balance sneakers on the plush carpet, a solid, honest anchor in a room full of silk and lies, and I realized that I didn't need the 14 credits to know that I had already passed the most important test of my life. I looked at Skylar one last time, her face pale and streaked with the mascara of a girl who had finally realized that the world didn't owe her a living at the expense of others. And then I looked at my mother, who still couldn't bring herself to meet my gaze. They were the ones who had told me to find a way, to take out a high-interest loan, to accept that my future was a secondary priority to a boost for the golden child. Well, I had found a way. I had found a way to use the very skills they had dismissed, the analytical precision, the attention to detail, the refusal to accept a flawed design, to dismantle the engine of their deception. I placed the microphone back on the podium with a deliberate click, the sound echoing through the room like a gavel, and I began my walk toward the double doors, leaving the slideshow to loop the bank statement over and over again for anyone who hadn't yet grasped the magnitude of the theft. The hallway outside the ballroom was silent and cool, a stark contrast to the burning intensity of the scandal I had just ignited. And as I walked toward the elevators, I felt the polyester of my graduation gown rustling around my legs like a victory flag. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, hard edges of my smartphone, knowing that Sarah was already receiving the first frantic calls from my father's legal team, calls that she would let go to voicemail because we had already won. The $64,000 was no longer a lost asset. It was a debt that would be repaid with interest, along with the triple damages that the Georgia trust statutes allowed for cases of intentional fiduciary breach. My father had wanted to reallocate my future, but he had only succeeded in reallocating his own fate from a man of prestige to a cautionary tale in a legal textbook. As the elevator doors slid shut, the last thing I saw was the golden light of the ballroom reflecting off the brass fixtures, a shimmering, expensive world that I was finally, permanently leaving behind for a sky that was wider and more honest than anything the Prescotts could ever imagine. I was Addison Prescott, and while I was still 14 credits away from my degree, I was now a woman who had proven that the strongest structures aren't built of mahogany and silk, but of the unwavering mathematical truth of who you are when the lights go out. By 2 a.m. on the night of the gala, the digital fallout from my revelation had already begun to dismantle the Prescott empire with a speed that even I, with all my calculations, hadn't fully anticipated. I sat in my parked 2012 Honda Civic outside a 24-hour diner, the blue light of my smartphone illuminating my face as I watched the notification pings arrive like distant artillery strikes. Because I had included the emails of his primary investors in the manila envelopes, my father's professional network had responded with the cold, ruthless efficiency of the financial sector. 3 of his most significant business partners had already sent formal intent to withdraw emails to his firm's compliance officer, citing the moral turpitude clauses and the undeniable evidence of fiduciary fraud that now sat on their bedside tables. The social and professional capital Julian Prescott had spent 30 years accumulating was evaporating in the time it took for a server to process an electronic signature. Simultaneously, the emergency injunction Sarah had filed worked with surgical precision. By the time the sun began to rise, Skylar's tuition payment at the private fashion institute was frozen by the bank's fraud department pending a full criminal and civil investigation. The $64,000 was no longer a gift or a reallocation. It was a flagged asset in a legal vacuum, and my sister's dreams of a Manhattan luxury loft were replaced by the cold reality of a frozen debit card and a looming deposition. Today, My life looks nothing like the mahogany-scented hallways of the Buckhead estate, and yet, for the first time in my 22 years, the air I breathe feels entirely my own. I live in a quiet 600-square-foot studio apartment on the edge of the city, a space where the floorboards creak and the kitchen is barely large enough for a single person to turn around in. There are no crystal chandeliers here, only a singular industrial desk where I keep my aerospace textbooks and the silver ring my grandfather gave me. The walls are thin enough that I can hear the distant hum of the city, but they are thick enough to keep out the voices of people who viewed me as an unpaid insurance policy. To settle the mounting legal fees and comply with the court-ordered restitution, my father was forced to undergo a public and humiliating liquidation of the very symbols he used to define his worth. He had to sell the white 2023 BMW 4 Series that Schuyler had treated as a birthright, and he was forced to resign his legacy membership at the Cherokee Town and Country Club to cover the settlement costs. The final judgment was absolute. He had to pay me back every single cent of the $64,000, plus a 12% interest penalty for the intentional breach of his fiduciary duty, a sum that ensured my final 14 credits and my entire master's program were fully funded without me ever having to speak to him again. I have implemented a strict 0% contact policy, a digital and emotional perimeter that is as impenetrable as the heat shielding on a re-entry capsule. I blocked their numbers, filtered their emails into a folder I will never open, and moved without leaving a forwarding address to the people who once called themselves my family. My mother tried to reach out once through a mutual acquaintance, claiming that family should stay together regardless of the cost. But I recognized the manipulation for what it was, an attempt to manage the optics of their own downfall. I didn't respond because I no longer require their validation to verify my existence. I am Addison Prescott, and I am exactly 3 months away from receiving my degree in aerospace engineering with honors. I still wear the same $40 New Balance sneakers, though the soles are now reinforced by the knowledge that I walked away from a burning empire and didn't look back to see who was holding the match. The hyper-realism of my current existence, the specific way the light hits my drafting table at 6 a.m., the exact cost of the organic coffee I buy with my own earned money, and the silence of a home where no one is being reallocated, is a wealth that cannot be measured in trust funds or luxury leases. I spend my evenings calculating the trajectories of satellites, understanding that for something to reach the stars, it must first shed the weight of everything that is holding it back. My father thought he was the architect of my life, but he was merely a flaw in the design that I had to identify and remove to ensure the structural integrity of my future. The legal fees he paid were the price of his arrogance, and the 12% interest was the cost of my suffering. But the freedom I gained is a variable that remains infinite. I think about Nana Grace often, about how she would have looked at the spreadsheets and the manila envelopes and smiled with the sharp, mathematical satisfaction of a woman who knew that the truth is the only constant in a world of variables. She didn't leave me money just so I could buy things. She left me a restricted educational covenant because she knew that my mind was the only asset that could never be stolen if I was willing to fight for it. Family isn't blood, and it certainly isn't a shared last name on a fraudulent wire transfer. Family is the person who protects your potential instead of harvesting it for someone else's comfort. It is the person who understands that love is a fiduciary duty of the heart, one that requires transparency, loyalty, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. As I sit in my studio tonight, looking at the city skyline from my small window, I don't feel the weight of the 14 credits or the sting of the betrayal. I feel the lightness of a life that has been stripped of its illusions. My father's $450 Ferragamo tie is likely sitting in a consignment shop now, and Schuyler is likely learning that a $1,200 Balenciaga hoodie doesn't provide much warmth when you have to pay your own heating bill. They are living in the wreckage of a reputation they destroyed with their own greed, while I am building a foundation that is anchored in the hard, unyielding bedrock of my own competence. The spreadsheets are finally balanced, the legal papers are filed away in a drawer, and the only path I am focused on is the one that leads upward, far beyond the reach of the people who tried to ground me. I am no longer the girl crying in a rain-slicked driveway. I am the woman who realized that cutting off the dead weight of a toxic legacy is not an act of malice, but an act of survival. To save my future, I had to be willing to lose the people who were actively sabotaging it, and in that loss, I found a version of myself that is unbreakable. The quiet of my 600-square-foot studio is the most beautiful sound I have ever heard, a peaceful resonance that proves I am finally, undeniably, and permanently free. My name is Addison Prescott. I am an aerospace engineer, and I have learned that the only way to truly fly is to make sure you are the one holding the controls of your own destiny. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and in the end, the only person who stayed for me was the one I saw in the mirror every morning at 4 a.m. in the lab. That was enough. That was everything. The story of the Prescotts ended in a ballroom at the Grand Heights Hotel, but my story is only just beginning, and this time the trajectory is perfect.